Alrighty, well, welcome to our latest podcast, which seems to be not quite as regular as we like to do, but now seems to be yet another special. We did a Christmas special as the last thing we did, and today we're going to do an Easter special. So welcome anybody who's listening at Easter time, and happy Easter to you if you
Happy
follow the
Easter.
Christian faith. And I'm Ken Powell, and Nick, you are.
I'm Nicholas Graham.
I've said just in case you've not been here before. I know a lot of people join us regularly. And at Christmas, we kind of talked about the various different things that Christmas can mean to us, from our own kind of personal traditions, like viewing habits and things like that, as well as the changing nature of the religious aspect of it. And I think we're probably going to do a similar thing today, Nick. I suspect that we'll
Yeah.
talk. Well, I mean, you can't talk about Easter really without talking about the death and resurrection, as believed by Christians around the world, of Christ. And
Yeah.
we will delve into lots of kind of religious subjects. One thing I know we've made some notes on this now, but I suddenly realised what we've not talked about is Easter eggs. So I'm going to just kick off with that. Are you an Easter eggs kind of guy or not?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a regular family thing, and various members of the family have very strong preferences about dark chocolate, milk chocolate, white chocolate, and so
Totally.
on. I'm a dark chocolate person myself. Um, uh, Everybody else seems to prefer the milk and the white thing, but yeah, it's a continuing and regular thing. And I was intrigued and amazed by the flurry on social media a couple of in the last week or so about whether Easter eggs were continuing to be a traditional Christian in inverted commas. That now is not the time to get into the cultural origins of that or of chocolate, I suspect. Other than to say, we are recording this in West Cumbria, which is a part of Britain that has an absolutely unique Easter egg related tradition, which is the pace egg. And for those of you who don't know, Cumbrians at Easter time will wrap up eggs in onion skins that they have preserved during Lent, wrap those up in newspaper, boil the eggs, and you end up with hard-boiled eggs with beautifully painted and coloured shells, which you then use to play a weirdly Cumbrian version of the game of Conkers, where you egg dump and somebody holds their egg underneath and somebody has an egg on top, and you smash them together to find whose shell breaks first. A completely weird and bizarre Cumbrian tradition. I don't know of anything similar happening anywhere else in the world, but
Yeah,
it's a
no, you're
great thing, and
absolutely right.
it seems to have continued. Unchanged for a very, very long time. And one of the interesting things we're looking at today on this podcast is how, certainly in our lifetimes, over the last 30, 40, or 50 years, how the Easter story, and particularly the events of Good Friday and Easter Sunday, are portrayed and are allowed to be portrayed and represented in popular entertainment, shall we say, in film, in television, and in novels, has changed immensely as our society has become willy-nilly a post-Christian society,
Mm-hmm.
um, and one in which a much greater variety of responses to those events and that story and the central personality in them are permitted and are culturally allowed. You just have to look at the outrage that greeted Monty Python's Life of Brian in the 80s. Now it's become installed as a part of our popular culture to the extent that Always Look on the Bright Side of Life is apparently now the number one choice for funeral music in this country. And so I think what we're going to do, Ken, is deal with a very sort of wide ranging thing. And we probably
Totally.
won't, there might be one or two things we dive into in detail and that I'd like to talk about. But basically, we're going to look at how the events of Easter are portrayed and pick out one or two left field things that are quite, unusual or different, or you wouldn't immediately think of as relating to this theme. So, where do you think we should start on that?
Well,
Where would you like
I'll
to
just
start?
throw in by adding to what you're saying about the kind of the change that has happened over the years. Although in some senses, I was just thinking as you were talking that we've almost got a potential of reversing back because I remember, well, I wasn't born at the time, but I remember that just in the 1960s, John Lennon making the classic mistake of saying, "Oh, we're more popular than Jesus." And
Jesus.
the
Yeah.
absolute kind of like outrage was people burning Beatles albums. And I said at a
Yeah,
point the Beatles
absolutely.
were universally, absolutely adored around the world and everything. And it was like the worst faux pas. And I think he had to apologize for saying it. And he kind of tried to clarify he wasn't saying he was better than Jesus. He was just saying they were extremely popular. And to
Yep.
be fair, he wasn't
Yeah.
wrong, but it was just that comparison to Jesus that was outrageous. I would say up to about 10 years ago, definitely nobody would bat an eyelid. I don't think, you'd still get,
Yeah,
very highly
absolutely.
religious people who might get upset somebody saying it, but it wouldn't be an outrage and kind of like headline news and things like that. I wonder with the current MAGA love that's going on in America and everything at the moment, and a certain amount of pseudo, I would say, pseudo Christian nationalist movements that are slowly growing in this country as well. I wonder whether that outrage would be felt again or will be soon.
I,
If somebody
I,
was to say something like that, I don't know whether we've come full circle and we've gone back to
It
a
would
kind
not,
of a
yeah,
religious culture.
it would not surprise me at all if that is what is coming down the line on this, and certainly the, I think, deeply regrettable and deplorable renaissance or invention of the idea of Christian nationalism, certainly in the UK, is pointing us in that direction.
Mm, yeah,
So let's find
I'm
some
worried.
ways of stemming that tide and pushing back against it, shall
Well,
we?
indeed. I mean, I hope to think that I would never have gone down the MAGA kind of route 20, 30 years ago. But I will just sort of say candidly for this podcast that I did come from a very evangelical Christian upbringing and conversion in the early 80s. So I was absolutely one of those who we will talk. In fact, maybe we should talk about it now. Try and get this right. The Last Temptation of Christ. When that movie came out, we were all like, we're going to petition outside the doors of
Yeah,
of the
absolutely.
cinemas until somebody pointed out, hang on a minute, we're doing this, and this is actually making this film really a lot more popular than it probably ought to be because we're doing this. It's getting in all newspapers, and now everyone wants to go and see the movie that's causing the fuss. Maybe we
Yeah.
should stop doing that. So I never actually did a placard, like a burn in hell fire type kind of thing outside the cinemas, but I was part of that ilk back in those days. These days, I'd be like, oh yeah. Brilliant, controversial movie. Let's go watch it.
Yeah,
Fantastic. And, completely
absolutely.
my kind of cup
And
of tea. The things have changed for
yeah,
me personally over the
yeah,
decades.
yeah. And I think, I mean, to take the example of the Last Temptation of Christ, yes, there was genuine outrage when it was originally produced. Just a bit of background on the film and the book on which it is based. Uh, Based on the novel by the great Cretan Greek writer Nikos Kazantzakis. It was actually only published posthumously in 1960 and caused real outrage in the Greek Orthodox Church when it was originally published. The story, I skim and give an extreme summary here, is Kazantzakis' Jesus is somebody who is absolutely torn between his feeling of duty to the authority of God and realizing that he is becoming the Messiah, and his desire for a ordinary family life in which he can marry the woman he loves, Mary Magdalene, um, and raise a family. And this tension plays out throughout the novel, right up to the moment where effectively he refuses the cross, and then has to reconsider his choices in life. The film, directed by Martin Scorsese in 2003, I think. It's available on both Netflix and Amazon Prime, and I urge people to go and see it. Or to
Rent it
take a
online.
look at it. It is a luminously beautiful um, and authentic imagining of first century Judea. Absolutely beautiful. Willem Dafoe as Jesus is stunningly authentic. He starts out effectively as a lackey for the Romans who is making crosses on which his fellow Jews can be crucified. And his journey from that position, aided, I have to say, in great measure by Harvey Keitel's Judas Iscariot. And Keitel, who I think has a reputation as playing a hard man in Scorsese's films. He was the pimp in Taxi Driver. He was a heavy, I think, in Mean Streets, but he's popped up in Scorsese's work at various points. And he made well, one of the recurring things we're going to look at, I think, is how Judas is portrayed in film
Mm, mm,
and novels here. Um, he tells Judas, interesting bit of authenticity. They give him red hair and a red beard, so that, that's an interesting bit of not quite canonical portrayal of who we think the historical Judas might have been. And the tension between them throughout is absolutely palpable. Scorsese makes the whole thing look luminously beautiful and intensely felt and experienced. He manages to make not just the nitty-gritty and the reality, but also the transcendent moments of revelation, of spiritual experience, just seem absolutely authentic. And I think it is an extraordinary achievement to bring those two together. He also manages, I guess, a very Roman Catholic view of the moral dilemma that Jesus is that William Defoe's Jesus is grappling with. On the one hand, it's he's grappling with sex and desire, the least interesting of the venal or mortal sins.
mm,
What he's actually also doing, and it's seamlessly knitted together, is dealing with the refusal of authority and betrayal as well, the most serious of mortal sins.
mm,
And Scorsese brings those together in an absolutely brilliant way. Does, I think, Kazantzakis' original vision very proud indeed. And it's a film that anybody, no matter what their religious belief or take or doubt or lack of religious belief, and so on, can watch and find an immense amount of humanity, of engagement and ideas in. It's a strong recommend. As I said, it's available on the major streaming services. Well worth your time this
mm,
Easter.
mm. I think one of the interesting things about it is the fact that it really focuses on Jesus' humanity, and
Absolutely.
traditional Christians, and definitely on the evangelical side, want to emphasize the whole Jesus as the 200% person, 100% man, 100% God. But the reality is that we tend to kind of like focus in much more on the 100. We seem to be more comfortable as the 100% God kind of thing. So the
Yeah.
idea, well, that part of the outrage was that Jesus could be tempted at all like this, in this kind of way,
Yeah.
and have these imaginings of what life might be. Was just like, no, Jesus the God would not do that, and that caused a real problem. And I think in a similar way, Jesus Christ Superstar, which I know of, as Andrew Lloyd Webber's musical. I remember watching parts of it back in the 80s again when I was at the peak of my evangelicalness, and being quite outraged by this portrayal of a very weak and very human Jesus. But also I didn't get the music as well, and the music was quite bizarre. It was not nice, clear cut, singable tunes that
Yeah.
in my young ages, in my young years, I thought was how a musical should be. Again, recently, about a couple of years ago, I think it was, I ended up reviewing it down in Manchester, and was just blown away by how good the music is. And I don't say that lightly about Andrew Lloyd Webber. I'm not a natural fan of him at all, but I found just myself thinking, actually, this music is really very, very good, but also just really taken by this portrayal as Jesus as a man.
Yeah,
And I thought,
absolutely.
wow, again, the fact that, how I've changed, but I think also how culture has changed as well. Because, like, again, I remember it caused a lot of controversy at the time when that musical first came out. Again, a lot of religious people having issues with it. Same issue with the Life of Brian, as you say. I remember I've seen clips of the Monty Python having to face theologians in interviews about it, and frankly winning because they were
Yes.
just as right, if not brighter, than the theologians.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
which is
yeah.
absolutely superb. I have to confess, as part of a little Christian group, I remember as a late teenager, we ended up watching Life of Brian and got caught by one of the Christian parents who like, I don't think you should be watching something like this, kind of thing. But we loved it. It was, I think, the nature of Monty Python, the reason why they are still such cultural icons, long after they've ceased to be a working group, or or half of them are not even alive now, but yet we all still just know their stuff. It's because it was just so damn good. And I think
Yeah.
even amongst those of us
Absolutely.
who were staunchly evangelical, we saw valid and very well done and very humorous criticism that was done. I think you've got something particularly to say on that.
Oh,
But
the
it was just so,
cheesemakers
so well
joke.
done.
Right, let me put the cheesemakers joke, one of my favourite jokes, for reasons that will become apparent, into the context of what we're grappling with here. And I think that what you said about 100% man, 100% God, and how the overlay of Christian theology provides a real dilemma for anybody trying to tell a story around this. And it is the fact that ultimately the historical Jesus is unknowable. The sources are primarily theological, polemic and discourse. They are not in any sense documentary, historical. And I know that's going to annoy a lot of people when I say that sort of thing. But the challenge that anybody trying to write narrative or film or theatre or television or novels about this period, whether it's historical fiction, whether it's musicals, whether it's epic, and so on, is trying to fit the verifiable historical reality into uh, a, a, a meaningful and coherent story. And it's worth, I think, saying a couple of things on that. One is that people tend not to notice this. Jesus Christ Superstar, certainly the film, has a lot of really interesting anachronistic stuff. Roman soldiers in sort of American military fatigues
Yeah, yeah.
tin helmets. That was an interesting choice. Incidentally, shout out from West Cumbria for the film version of Jesus Christ Superstar, script by the great Cumbrian writer Melvyn Bragg.
Ah,
A little known credit on his extremely long, varied, and rich CV.
yeah.
Um, but again, that's available on the streaming services. Go and see it. Some of the songs are absolutely extraordinarily good.
They are, and I recommend go see it in the theatre because it is still
Yeah,
touring and doing stuff. I
yeah.
saw it a couple of years ago, as I say, with Julian Clary playing Herod, because
Oh, that will be
it's one of the fun.
marvelous.
It's the only fun part of the entire show, which is otherwise unmitigating doom and gloom, because it is just dealing with the last days of Christ, and of
Yeah.
course Judas Iscariot's anguished uh, pain inside himself as to what he's doing, and it is quite sympathetic towards Judas Iscariot in many ways. And you get the one fun cameo of King Herod with his King of the Jews song, which is just
Yes.
absolutely
Yeah,
hilarious. And
yeah. I mean, a marvelous show-stopping scene. The other thing to bear in mind is that one of the things about Life of Brian, Terry Jones, the late Terry Jones, was a considerable scholar. He published, scholarly works on history. He really knew his stuff, and the way he works. Historical material into the jokes and the narrative, as well as doing the parody and pastiche of Spartacus and things of that sort in Life of Brian is really clever. Let's do the cheesemakers joke. Everybody
yes.
knows, oh, how Sermon on the Mount, how blessed are the peacemakers. Cheesemakers? Did he say cheesemakers? And everybody thinks this is hilarious. However, it's a very clever layered joke that Terry Jones has put together there. Because if you look at old antique maps of Jerusalem, you will see that in between, in the what is now the old city, in between Mount Zion and Mount Opal, which is where the temple was, there's a valley, and it's labelled in old maps with the Greek word tyropoietin, which means the Valley of the Cheesemakers. Well, how did a place in Jerusalem come to be known as the Valley of the Cheesemakers? And let me say, archaeological evidence tells us without doubt that the manufacture of cheese was not going on in this location at any time in antiquity. They reckon that what happened was a map maker looked at a Hebrew description of Jerusalem and misread the Hebrew word for temple wall and thought that it was sounded a bit like the Greek for cheese making. And that is how we ended up with the Valley of the Cheesemakers, which is how we then ended up with Terry Jones's very good joke about blessed are the cheesemakers. And I know that jokes are never as funny when you explain them as when you actually hear them. But I'll leave that with you. And the next time you watch Life of Brian, just remember the cheesemakers, or indeed everybody involved in the manufacture of dairy products, are blessed.
Indeed, yeah. And I think this, again, I mean, like Monty Python and Joe, we're just doing an often unrealized, very clever take on religious beliefs. I think in general, and obviously wrapped up in the story of Christ. Despite the fact that they went to pains to sort of say this is not Christ, Brian is not Christ, and of course that's
Yeah,
exactly what
absolutely.
he's saying himself in the movie, which is the
Yeah.
whole point from all that. But the aspect of the again of the kind of the humanity of it all, I think is really quite important. There have been quite a few attempts over the years to do that. One of the weirder ones that I remember watching was called The Second Coming. It was an early Russell T Davies program and starred Christopher Eccleston, who would eventually become the first rebooted Doctor Who,
Yeah.
written by Russell T Davies himself.
Yes.
And it was a very peculiar retelling of the Return of Jesus, although it was really just doing the Passion story all over again, except that now he's a Geordie guy called Steve Baxter. And it's just bizarre. And I remember watching at the time, it was the early 2000s, it came out, I thought, what on earth is this? And I think it's probably right that has died a death and no one has ever heard of it. And it was
Yeah,
something that
absolutely.
comes back into my mind is like, what on earth?
That is extraordinary. I
Peculiar.
thought, yeah, I thought I knew or had stumbled over virtually every representation in popular culture, film, theatre, TV, etc., novels, etc. I've not come across that one before.
It was very, very
Sideline.
strange.
I used to know a guy called Steve Baxter. He wasn't the Messiah. He was a very good science fiction writer. I don't know whether there's any connection
I
there.
don't
Who
know either. I mean, it
knows?
just seems very strange with Russell T Davies, who has been a lifelong sci-fi fan and Doctor Who fan, of course, which is it
Yeah.
was his project to bring Doctor Who back to the screens, and very glad that he did because it was some fantastic stuff that he did with the rebooted Doctor Who and brought back a whole love for the old Doctor Who for a lot of people as well. So it was very good. So whether I mean it is a bit of a strange coincidence for that kind of
It's
that
it,
tie-up, isn't it?
yes. But
Another
just quick question:
yeah, sorry.
is that still available anywhere? Is it on
Yes, I think
streaming
you can.
services? It is.
I
Oh,
think
right,
you can. You
excellent.
might have to buy DVDs of it, but I think it is
Yeah,
available. And I
right.
will research this when we finish, and try and put links to anything that I can find that people
Yeah,
can
that would
go
be
look at or
great.
buy or things like that. To
Yeah,
so there's some links for people to make use of if they're interested in doing so. Another sci-fi writer from the 60s also did a story, and I remember I researched it for this podcast. I'm glad I did because it turned out to be nowhere near as weird and peculiar as I had it being described to me. And this was a book called Behold the Man by Michael Moorcock, who is quite a well-respected sci-fi writer in the 60s, I believe.
absolutely. Yeah,
And his story has somebody time traveling back to the time of Jesus, only to discover that the Jesus of real, the real timeline, is not the man that we've all come to know from the Bible at all. And he realizes there's a big problem here that his timeline, our timeline, is going to be eradicated because this is just not the right Jesus. And he
yeah,
takes his place, and he does so in order to make the timeline right, which ultimately, of course, must lead to him dying on the cross for
yes,
doing that. And I can't remember how the book kind of finishes from that, but it's a lot. It's a real kind of look at identity, the importance of myth making. A real big kind of like what if kind of book, which in some senses is exactly what Terry Pratchett does with his Discworld stuff. All the time.
yeah,
So kind of like what does things like the invention of the steam engine or the telegraph or postage stamps and things like that, and just putting it in a different kind of context and saying what actually do these mean? And of course, one of the big things with Terry Pratchett is the importance of the mythical character that's very real of
yeah,
death,
yeah,
and of the Tooth Fairy and the Father Christmas who's the Hog Father and so on and so forth. And it's like, how important are these things that they exist rather than necessarily that they are true?
yeah,
And
yeah.
a very important point
Uh,
that comes out of that. And again, something that we can ask much more freely, I think, about the whole Christian faith today.
yeah, I think that spurs me to think that yes, that is the idea that we can make our own history or remake history as we wish it to be. It's a question of whether you believe, I suppose, in history as conspiracy or preordained or something going on in the background pulling the strings, or history as random nonsense. And both of them are ways of looking at the world and throwing you back on your own resources for making meaning out of it. Christians, I guess, would believe that that history does neither rhymes nor repeats. There are two absolutely unique events, the incarnation and the resurrection, which determine everything else about how we think about history after that and our experience after that, and give us a template for understanding who we are and where we are in history. The problem, I think, for a lot of if you're sitting down and trying to write fiction or a film script without the necessity of supernatural invention, you are then faced with making your own story and
Mm,
making it real in a way that poses, I think, some really interesting problems. And I think some of the things we're looking at today have come up with incredibly ingenious and brilliant ways of solving that problem and of making
mhm,
fiction, let's not beat about the bush, entertainment out of it in a way that is really satisfying, stimulating, and
mhm.
extremely high quality, shall we say. And
Yeah,
I'd
yeah.
include everything from the life of Brian through to, the more obviously reverential and less comic treatments of that. Is that a good time to start talking about Anthony Burgess, Man of Nazareth, Jesus of Nazareth, and things
You're
like that?
segueing quite nicely into that. I'll
Yeah,
just take well, not a detour,
yeah,
but I'm just going to put a little thing
yeah,
to
sure.
get to that. So saying that, within that, taking the more serious. I think one of the aspects that's coming in is the way that theology started to change very much in the advent of the theory of evolution, late 19th century and early 20th century developments, where the questioning of can we still keep the cultural trappings of our religion and indeed some kind of form of faith without necessarily having to have an almighty, omnipotent God and an all-powerful, God Jesus, but who could just be human? And I think there were some interesting scholarly attempts to do that, or semi-scholarly attempts to do it. One of which, of course, was Jesus: The Evidence by Ian Wilson, who I believe was
Yeah,
a staunch Roman Catholic, and yet was looking,
yeah,
really questioning the historical evidence and what we believe about him, and I think was trying to conclude that Jesus actually didn't die on the cross and managed to survive that. And I think that came from an earnest belief that it's very difficult to hold on to a traditional belief in Christ these days. And you could do it. I definitely know plenty of people do, and I've done it myself for decades. But it's actually very hard to do. Is there a way to, in actual fact, to rethink theology, rethink history, and everything like that, and still keep some kind of faith? And another person that did something similar was a woman called Barbara Thiering, who was an Australian theologian who wrote Jesus the Man, and she wanted to take the whole thing as being a political movement, and she was
yeah,
reinterpreting the Dead Sea Scrolls and the whole sect that looked after those or part of those, and seeing that as being a continuous political movement that was against the Romans that Jesus was actually part of, and all the miracles, all the including the blessed are the cheesemakers type kind of Sermon on the Mount stuff, is actually coded political language, and she worked very hard to make all this supernatural stuff actually have a genuine, real meaning. But it wasn't
yeah, yeah.
supernatural; it was very
It was
human. It was actually
political.
political.
Yeah,
I think both things failed, but the fact that people were trying to do that, I think, is very, very important. Which segues us onto the idea of scholarly works, looking at Jesus,
yeah, absolutely.
including
I would,
Burgess's work.
yeah. I would add to those two a third book, The Human Christ by Charlotte Allen, a Roman Catholic writer who does a survey of attempts to reconstruct what absolutely minimal evidence of the history we have, and comes to the conclusion that the human Christ is unknowable. Actually, it's the transcendent Christ who is knowable. I think that is a book that I think is worth
Mhm.
looking at alongside the two that you mentioned. Shall we talk about a deeply political but also reverential view of um, the life? And it's worth putting it in the context that, I mean, I think that we shouldn't shy away from the idea of the political context here. It is worth holding on to I think, unassailable fact that the charge on which Jesus was condemned and executed was being king of the Jews. In other words, it was a political act because quick bit of first century AD history. The previous kingship had been held by Herod the Great, and after his death, the Roman emperor Augustus at the time, followed by Tiberius, simply refused for political reasons to set up a client king as his proxy ruler of Judea. Therefore, declaring yourself king was a deeply political and subversive and seditious act, and that was the reason that he was executed. And it's worth hanging on to that and seeing the evidence in that context. And in terms of films that do this, probably the absolute classic in this respect is Pier Paolo Pasolini's The Gospel According to St. Matthew. What you may well ask is a gay Marxist film director doing in the 60s, making a
The context of what we've been talking about is
yeah,
perfectly welcome here.
absolutely, yeah, a deeply reverential and absolutely played straight, faithful to the text film of the Gospel according to St. Matthew. What he produces is an absolutely extraordinary tour de force. Incidentally, he filmed this with a largely amateur cast of peasant actors in southern Italy. He cast his own mother as the Virgin Mary, which I think, as an act of sheer bravado and brilliance, is probably unparalleled in this particular field. And he produced a work of extraordinary beauty and extraordinary moral depth and profundity as well, because his Jesus is somebody who has come to absolutely upend the established order, to turn everything on its head and change social, economic, political reality. Utterly and forever, which is what you'd expect a Marxist film director grappling with the life of Christ to do. And he does it supremely well. And incidentally, he establishes a visual grammar that subsequent filmmakers have really exploited and used. The long, intense close-up on faces, without dialogue, without sound. The sort of splitting out into very large scale panoramic shots of figures moving in landscape in order to tell stories. It's a ravishingly beautiful and deeply moving portrayal. And if you're going to go off to the streaming services and look for a good Easter film, this is another prime choice. Can we also talk about La Ricotta? Because Pasolini didn't just do one film about the crucifixion, he did two. He also did a short film, 30 minutes, called La Ricotta, after the Italian cheese. And this is a Marxist film director making a film about a Marxist film director, played by the great Orson Welles. The film he is making is about the crucifixion and the events of Good Friday. And he sees it entirely through the eyes of the peasant extra who has been hired to play one of the thieves being crucified alongside Jesus. And our peasant extra, our hero for this particular portrayal of Good Friday, is having a lousy time. He's hot, he's exhausted, he's sweaty, he's hating being up on the cross all morning, while our Marxist film director contemplates how he's going to find meaning in this. So they all break for lunch, and the extra's wife brings him his lunch, a ricotta cheese. And he is so hungry, he absolutely gorges himself on the cheese, at which point it's, right, back to work, guys, get up on the cross again. And I won't tell you what happens next. That would be a terrible, terrible spoiler. But the outcome of this suffering and excess is absolutely heartbreaking. And you'll have to go and find the film yourself to see it. But if there is one, it's available on YouTube, by the way, not on any of the main streaming services. It's available on YouTube. If there is one totally left field view of Easter that you treat yourself to this Easter, La Ricotta by Pier Paolo Pasolini has got to be it.
I kind of wish I'd realised there was going to be the cheese connection there, because I would have gone to the Monty Python film there, because that would have
It's
been
another
an actual
cheesemaker joke.
another cheesemaker. How bizarre! And yes, I mean, just you, Nick, to come to find the most peculiar and strange of things that there are out in this world. Which is going to be my segue through to actually talking about Burgess, because I tend to think of Burgess as being pretty strange. Is he pretty strange when it comes to Christ?
No, he isn't.
Make it make
For
sense.
those who are only familiar with Anthony Burgess through the lens of Clockwork Orange,
Totally. That would be me.
let's just say, I mean, Burgess was, an absolutely titanic figure of British literature in the second half of the 20th century. His background was Roman Catholic, and his works are shot through with the struggle to reconcile ideas of sin and free will and get past the weird language and the violence. Clockwork Orange is essentially about the struggle between original sin and free will. What he does with well, there are two things that we need to talk about here. One is Man of Nazareth, the book,
Mhm.
which is his novelization of Franco Zeffirelli's Jesus of Nazareth TV series from the late 70s, which we can talk about in due course because it's
Mm.
really interesting. Burgess wrote the script for Zeffirelli's TV series. He then wrote two novels himself, one Man of Nazareth, the other dealing with the events of the gospel. The second one, The Kingdom of the Wicked, dealing with the early history of Christianity. Um, Man of Nazareth is crackingly good, and it's a very straight portrayal of the events of the gospel, seen through the eyes of a fiercely intelligent but doubting and doubt-stricken Catholic who is struggling with the idea of how do I respond to this,
Mm.
and the way he responds through the events is, I think, brilliantly well done. There is an element of Jesus and the disciples that is kind of recognizably Alex and the Droogs, the leader of the small
Got to
band
be there. Some.
who are outside of society and trying to make their way. Burgess was also a composer of some stature, and it's really interesting that he has the disciples write songs and music and sing the gospel, sing the message, which I suspect he had one eye on Jesus Christ Superstar there, which kind of
Probably.
predates Man of Nazareth by 10 years or thereabouts. But he deals with the supernatural very effectively. He tops and tails the narrative with the two great Johannine miracles, the marriage at Cana and the raising of Lazarus. And the marriage at Cana and water into wine is portrayed as a simple conjuring trick, sleight of hand. The disciples and the guests aren't smart enough to notice what he did there. By the time we get to the return of Lazarus from the dead, it is sheer inexplicable wonder at supernatural intervention. In between, we've had Jesus and the disciples and the narrator grappling with the idea of what is it about us that makes us need redemption, need this man and his message. And it is brilliantly well done. It's not an easy book to get hold of. It's been out of print for a while, but it is well worth seeking out, either online or in secondhand bookshops. It is, for my money, one of the best straight but really interesting and engaged portrayals of the gospel as historical fiction, as it were. The Kingdom of the Wicked, his follow-on from that, does read more like a proposal for a film series that was never actually made, and it wasn't. But it is very good indeed at reconciling the idea of the narration of the growth and spread of the early church with the political events of the Roman Empire in the middle of the first century AD. And it leading up to the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem at the end of the Jewish revolt against the Romans. Incidentally, a historical event whose effects are still with us today in the Middle East. So if you're looking to engage with ideas that are, whether you like them or not, contemporary and important, The Kingdom of the Wicked is a really good place to start.
Mm.
Anthony Burgess's two Jesus novels are, for my money, very well worth it indeed.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I certainly, well, from my knowledge of that, of course, is entirely from the Zeffirelli series of that, which was remarkable, I think, in both eliciting the very fair criticism that Jesus seems, for a first century Jew, seems awfully very white and Western looking because of
Yeah.
the remarkable Robert Powell taking the part. At the
Well,
same time
yeah,
as everyone kind of going, but those eyes are absolutely
yeah.
gorgeous. I mean, it
Uh,
was a powerful
I
portrayal,
think
I think.
Bobby Powell turned in an absolutely transcendent performance there. I mean, yes, he is a blue-eyed and very Anglo-Saxon,
Yes,
Northwest European Jesus, but what he brought to that role, in terms of the commitment, the pain, the
yeah,
intensity, was absolutely extraordinary, and he shone out in a cast that was an absolutely stellar roll call of the truly great actors of the time. Laurence Olivier, Anne Bancroft, Rod Steiger as Pontius Pilate. I mean, and I well remember when it first was aired on television, there was a real sense of frisson of, oh, what's this about? What's going on here? Why is this being done at all?
mm,
But Zeffirelli and Burgess between them played it, I think, very straight indeed and did an absolutely crackingly good job. I think it now looks a little like exactly what it is, a big budget television series that put together on an absolutely international global basis by some of the finest directors, writers, actors, and
yeah,
film technicians of the time. It
mm,
really doesn't get much better and more brilliantly
mm,
good, I think,
mm,
albeit we can now look back and say, oh, well, actually, it's of its time, but it
yeah,
is
yeah,
extremely
yeah.
high quality.
And of its
Yeah.
time is possibly I think the very last vestiges of a of an assumed communal belief in the traditional Christ
Yeah, yeah,
and Christian religion. I think it was the very last, the tail end of everybody claiming Christianity as their birthright. Even if in actual fact they were no longer going to church, or indeed may not have ever gone to church, other than for baptisms and weddings and
yeah,
funerals and such
yeah.
like. And that kind of, but in the day, it was or you very definitely said you were Christian, even if you never touched the Bible and never prayed or
Yeah,
anything like that.
absolutely.
It was a matter of pride. Whereas now people, would quite happily say they're of no particular faith or whatever. Although, as I say, we start to head back towards the Tommy Robinsons of this world, who I suspect mostly have not darkened the doors of a church, but are now
Yeah,
reclaiming their
I,
Christian heritage and weaponizing it, unfortunately, for what I consider to
well,
be not good reasons.
yeah, political opportunism of a particularly despicable sort, I think.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
shall we think a bit more about maybe some slightly left field, genuinely left field ways of looking at Easter? Shall we talk about A.L. Kennedy and Paradise?
sure. Yeah, do go.
Because this
There's
I
one book
think
I
is
definitely
real.
want to make mention of, but I'm going to leave that
Yeah.
to last.
Okay.
But yes,
We're right. We'll come to that. The great contemporary Scottish writer A.L. Kennedy, Paradise, her novel of 2005. What on earth has the story of a alcoholic Scotswoman got to do with Easter? You may well ask. Let's step back and remind ourselves. I'm going to do a quick diversion into literary theory here. James Joyce's Ulysses, universally revered, in some cases hated, but
In
as
many cases, unread.
the absolute monument of 20th century literature. T.S. Eliot pointed out that what Joyce did there was what he called a continuous parallel between a contemporary narrative, Leopold Bloom wandering around 1904, is it 1904? Dublin, with a mythic substrate or background, the wanderings of Odysseus, and the parallel between the mythic base and the modern superstructure was what gave the whole concept its life. Kennedy does exactly that approach in Paradise. She takes the traditional Christian liturgy of the Stations of the Cross, which, for those who are not familiar with it, is a devotional exercise for Good Friday, where you follow I think it's 15 individual stages of Jesus's suffering and death from the moment he is um, scourged and given the crown of thorns and the cross to his death and burial. And she maps the absolutely horrifying and deeply, deeply disturbing decline and fall of Hannah, a contemporary Scots woman, into alcoholic destruction. It achieves the incredibly difficult feat of actually engaging and drawing you in with a narrative of addiction. Treat this as personal prejudice, if you will. I find most narratives of addiction quite stunningly boring and tedious, whether it's alcohol, heroin, cocaine, gambling. I don't share those addictions, and most writing about them, it doesn't provide you with a way in unless you share that obsession. There are some notable exceptions, of which Kennedy's is preeminent, I think. But what she does is provide us with an absolutely harrowing but utterly beguiling and engaging view of the progress to destruction of an addiction. And it is done with all the intensity, the authenticity, and the linguistic brilliance that Kennedy is capable of. If you are looking for a novel to put alongside Pasolini's La Ricotta as a genuinely affecting, deeply moving, but quite left field and unexpected response to the Easter story, I would, again, strongly recommend you seek this out and give it a read. It's brilliant.
Brilliant. Well, that segues me very nicely into a book that I would definitely recommend for people to read, which takes us back to, I think, what we were saying earlier on about looking at different perspectives of how we can see the Christian story and the
Yeah.
Passion, and also about Judas Iscariot himself. As I say, usually he is just the bad guy. And as I say, gets a certain degree of sympathetic treatment in Jesus Christ Superstar, but he's
Yeah.
still the bad guy. But there is a certain book titled the Judas Case by a certain Nicholas Graham
Yeah.
that I think takes quite a sympathetic view about Judas, even though the poor blighter still ends up dead, right from the beginning of it, I think. Tell us about your journey with that, Nick.
Yeah.
What made you want to write about Judas? Really,
Well,
I mean, even though he's
well,
he's gone in the book.
isn't this interesting? I'd wanted for a very long time to write a historical fiction about the events of the gospel. And the question is, as we've just been discussing, how do you do this in a realistic and historically verifiably authentic way? And just to be clear, I do think that doing the events of the gospel is probably the biggest single challenge you can set yourself as a historical novelist, because no set of events in our culture are more overlain with 2,000 years worth of accumulated meaning, interpretation, assumption. How really good historical fiction tells you about the period that it's written about, not the period it's written in. So how do you peel away those onion skin layers? And I'd racked my brains for a very long time. And the idea came quite out of the blue. Well, hang on, people have tried to see this through Judas's eyes before, and Judas has been portrayed as a deeply conflicted um, character. What if he'd been working for the temple police all along? And this was actually his mission. He was playing it straight throughout. He was somebody pretending to be something that he wasn't. And when you look at the accounts of his death, both in the Gospel, in the Acts of the Apostles, and in other non-canonical contemporary writers, none of them add up. They're describing what happened to him as the circumstances as being completely different in each case. Either he hanged himself, or his guts burst out, or he was knocked over by a cart in a road accident. That's the non-canonical account of his death. So I thought, right, we've got witnesses who can't agree on what happened and what they saw. We've got somebody who's plausibly portrayed as an undercover agent for the Temple Police. This is a great detective story waiting to be written. And while we're doing that detective story, the events of the gospel are being looked at through that lens from a unique viewpoint and in a completely different way. And so that was the task that I set myself when I decided to write the Judas case. And it I leave it to you to interpret that. It's still available from the publisher and good bookshops.
Absolutely, yes, and I definitely highly recommend it to people. It's a peculiar one in that, whilst it's very definitely a detective story, it's not like your usual kind of detective fiction. So if you like detective fiction, you'll probably enjoy it. But it is left field, I think, in many respects, because it's much more philosophical, I think, in many ways, including discussing the nature of faith and what that looks like, and belief in general, but also somehow remarkably, the show is stolen, as it were, by your chief character, who is doing the investigation, because it actually becomes, in the end, I think, his life story, which is far more important and both beautiful and tragic. And I think that's the real quality of the book. That in actual fact, that even though all these really fascinating and interesting historical events are being discussed and going around for the whole thing of Judas, and what was he up to and why, and so on and so forth, and what actually was going on with Jesus and his gang, exactly what was this movement that was going on, and what are the implications for the future. We're actually more invested in your main character, whose name I've momentarily forgotten. Remind me the name.
Solomon Eliades, or Solomon Ben Eleazar, to give it the Hebrew form, the Greek form. The events of both Judas's life and death and Jesus's are seen through the eyes of his investigation. The mise en scène is that Solomon is a retired spy master who is called back in to investigate one final case, the death of the death in mysterious and unexplained and conflicting circumstances of his greatest pupil and most successful agent, Yehuda from Kerioth. And he finds, as he does this, that his own assumptions and his own life start falling apart.
Mm.
And he is a quite different man in a different circumstance at the end of the novel from the beginning. No spoilers, but he starts the novel married to his very formidable wife Zenobia, they're running a successful vineyard in the Judean hills. By the time we come to the end of the novel, 7 days later, everything about his life has changed. So that's
Don't give too much away.
one of the important. I won't give too much away.
It's definitely well worth reading. I think it's a fabulous read, and as I say, I think it's a very, very beautiful book. I think that's probably a good place. There are things that I've got away with. There's definitely other things that we had on our list.
There always are. Never enough time to fit everything in.
No, indeed. But I think it's been a fascinating run, and I'm very glad you've reminded me of the tradition, which I think my good Cumbrian wife has forgotten as well. And I'll just remind her with Good Friday. As we're recording, Good Friday is tomorrow. That we must make sure we've got some eggs and do our pace eggs, and then do I think, is it called chucky eggs? Is it chucky eggs for or is that where you throw the?
It's called egg. I'm not sure what chucky eggs are. It's egg dumping
Egg dumping that way, because we definitely do the whole conker things with the eggs as well. That kind of thing. And I can't remember if chucky eggs is where you've got to throw them. Is that's a
not sure.
thing as well? Where you see how far you can throw them. But peculiar Cumbrian traditions, but great fun, and ones that my family have definitely done. And I will remind my wife that we must have our eggs tomorrow for Good Friday. And on that note, thank you very much, Nick, and thank you to all those who made it to the end. And have a good Easter, all of you, and we'll see you again soon, no doubt.
Yeah, thank you, Ken, and a very happy Easter to everybody. We will be back.
Indeed. All right, take care, guys.